Walk into a modern house on a deep winter morning and you can feel the compromise immediately. The heating system is running. Warm air moves through the vents. The thermostat shows the number you asked for. Yet the floor stays cold, the air feels dry, and comfort exists only in certain pockets of the house. Heat is being produced constantly, but it never seems to settle. Most people treat this as unavoidable. Winter costs energy. Heat leaks out. Homes need constant input. That idea feels settled, almost natural. If you want warmth, you keep feeding the system. If you want efficiency, you accept discomfort. Either way, warmth is something you chase. Now place that assumption beside early frontier life. Homes were built fast, with limited tools and little margin for error. When heat failed, the house didn't cool slightly, it became unlivable. And yet the heating method settlers relied on demanded constant fuel and constant attention, just to hold the line. That contradiction is the starting point here. Not toughness, not nostalgia, but a simple question. Why did a system that never held heat become normal in homes built for survival? An open fireplace feels like a heater because it produces flame, light, and immediate warmth. But physically, it behaves very differently from what people expect. Most of the heat from an open fire moves by convection, not storage. Hot gases rise rapidly and are drawn upward by the chimney. Measurements taken in traditional open hearths show that 70 to 90% of the heat energy produced by the fire exits the building directly through the flue. In some cases, efficiency drops below 10%, meaning less than 1/10 of the fuel's energy actually contributes to warming the room. The airflow makes the problem worse. A burning fire creates negative pressure inside the house. As hot air escapes up the chimney, replacement air must come from somewhere. In early homes, that air entered through gaps around doors, windows, roof joints, and wall seams. Cold outdoor air was pulled inward continuously, often at floor level, exactly where people sat and slept. This creates a paradox. The harder the fire burns, the faster warm indoor air is removed. Stronger fires increase draft strength. Increased draft increases air exchange. More air exchange means more cold air entering the house. The result is not stable warmth, but turbulence. Hot, near the fire. Cold everywhere else. The structure itself offers almost no help. Stone, brick, and clay around an open hearth absorb some heat, but not enough to act as meaningful thermal storage. Once the flames weaken, surface temperatures fall quickly. Studies of traditional hearth rooms show interior temperatures dropping 10-15 degrees Celsius, 18-27 degrees Fahrenheit, within hours after a fire dies down in cold conditions. That's why open fireplaces demand constant tending. If the fire is not actively burning, the heating system effectively turns off. There is no buffer, no stored reserve, no delay between fuel input and temperature loss. From a systems perspective, an open fireplace is not a heater at all. It is an exhaust system that happens to leak warmth. It prioritizes smoke removal over heat retention. It was designed to make indoor fire survivable, not efficient. And that distinction matters. Because once you recognize that the fireplace removes more heat than it stores, the core contradiction becomes unavoidable. Burning more fuel does not solve the problem. It accelerates it. This is the mechanical failure at the heart of early domestic heating. Heat was being created, but it was never being held. Once the failure of open fire heating is understood mechanically, a new question immediately follows. If the system wasted fuel and demanded constant labor, why did frontier homes continue to rely on it? The answer lies in how frontier housing was actually built. Early frontier settlement prioritized speed over performance. Shelter had to be erected quickly, often before the first hard winter. Tools were limited. Transporting heavy materials was difficult. Skilled specialists were rare or entirely absent. A heating system succeeded if it could be built with local stone, clay, timber, and basic masonry knowledge. Open fireplaces fit those constraints perfectly. They required no precise internal geometry. A vertical chimney, a hearth opening, and a firebox were enough to make the house functional. Any mason or even an improvised builder could construct one. It didn't need to be optimized. It only needed to work now. More advanced heating systems required something frontier life rarely offered: time. Time to design. Time to gather extra materials. Time to build mass slowly and correctly. That time had opportunity cost. Every day spent perfecting a heating system was a day not spent clearing land, securing food, repairing tools, or preparing for storms. The labor cost of the fireplace was hidden inside daily life. Wood cutting, hauling, splitting, stacking, and feeding the fire became routine winter work. Fires had to be maintained through the night. Ash had to be cleared. Chimneys had to be watched for sparks and buildup. These costs were not paid once they were paid every day, but because the labor was distributed across time and absorbed by the household. The system's inefficiency never appeared as a single failure. It appeared as normal winter life. This is how the system externalized its cost. Instead of failing structurally, it transferred the burden onto people. Cold rooms became expected. Interrupted sleep became expected. Fuel gathering became expected. None of these outcomes were traced back to the heater itself. They were blamed on climate, season, or necessity. Once a system embeds its costs into routine behavior, it becomes very difficult to question. It stops being seen as a design choice and starts being seen as reality. That normalization is why open-fire heating persisted, not because it was effective, but because it fit frontier constraints better than anything that required patience. Despite its dominance, the open fireplace was not the only way people heated buildings in cold climates. A different pattern existed, one that approached heat as something to be stored rather than constantly replaced. This alternative system shared several defining principles, regardless of regional variation. First, fuel was burned hot and briefly, not slowly all day. Fires were intense, lasting a few hours rather than continuously smoldering. Second, the heat from that fire was directed into a large mass brick, stone, earth, or ceramic before exiting the structure. Third, the fire itself was physically separated from the living air. Smoke and combustion gases were contained and guided through internal channels rather than released into the room. The result was a heater that behaved very differently. Once the fire went out, the house stayed warm. Heat stored in the mass radiated slowly for 6 to 12 hours, sometimes longer, depending on construction. Interior temperatures declined gradually rather than collapsing once fuel input stopped. To someone accustomed to open fires, this system feels wrong at first. There is no visible flame. There is no constant tending. The room remains warm, even though the fire is gone. Less fuel produces more comfort. The cause and effect relationship people are used to fire equals heat no longer applies in a simple way. This is why disbelief often arises here. If burning less fuel kept spaces warmer for longer, why wasn't this obvious everywhere? The answer is that these systems were not intuitive. They relied on thermal mass, not immediate sensation. Their performance revealed itself over time, especially overnight, exactly when open fireplaces failed most severely. The distinction is crucial. Open fire heating treats warmth as something that must be continuously chased. Mass-based heating treats warmth as something you charge, then live off. One system fights heat loss every minute. The other accepts loss but delays it. At this stage of the investigation, the tension remains unresolved. The physics suggest the mass-based approach aligns better with long winters and limited fuel. Yet it was not widely adopted on the frontier. Understanding why requires looking not just at the technology, but at what happened when these ideas partially appeared, and why they failed to fully transfer. At this point, disbelief is natural. The idea that homes could stay warm long after the fire went out sounds like folklore unless the physics are made visible. The key mechanism is thermal mass. Dense materials, brick, stone, packed earth, ceramic absorb heat slowly and release it slowly. Unlike air, which changes temperature rapidly, these materials act as reservoirs. Once heated, they resist rapid temperature loss. Measurements of masonry heating structures show surface temperatures declining gradually over many hours rather than minutes. In cold conditions, a large heated mass can keep interior spaces within a stable comfort range for 8 to 12 hours after combustion ends. The room does not spike hot and crash cold. It settles. Radiant heat explains why this feels different. Radiant warmth heats bodies, walls, and floors directly, not just the air. A room with lower air temperature but warm surrounding surfaces often feels more comfortable than a room with hot air and cold walls. This is why people sitting near warm masonry can remain comfortable even as air temperatures drift downward. Combustion quality reinforces the effect. Short, intense burns reach higher temperatures, which improves combustion efficiency. More of the fuel's energy becomes heat instead of smoke. Smoldering fires common in open hearths, kept alive overnight, produce incomplete combustion. That wastes fuel and releases particulates and gases into the living space. Indoor air quality follows naturally from this difference. Open hearth rooms historically showed persistent smoke exposure. Soot accumulation on ceilings, beams, and walls was common. Enclosed systems isolate combustion entirely. Smoke is never part of the living environment. The air people breathe remains separate from the fire that heats the structure. This is not a cultural preference. It is a physical outcome. The same materials behave the same way regardless of who builds them. Heat storage, radiant transfer, and combustion completeness are not traditions. They are constraints imposed by physics. At this stage, the evidence tightens the contradiction. A system existed that used less fuel, required less nightly labor, produced cleaner air, and delivered more stable warmth. All outcomes frontier life desperately needed. Yet this system did not become dominant. That gap between physical advantage and historical adoption is no longer mysterious in theory. It now demands explanation in practice. Interestingly, frontier builders did not completely miss these principles. They encountered them repeatedly, but often in fragmented or accidental ways. Sod houses and earth-backed walls are one example. Thick earth walls absorbed daytime heat and released it slowly overnight. Settlers noticed that these structures felt more stable in temperature than thin wooden cabins. The benefit was real, but it was rarely understood as a heating system. It was treated as a property of the wall, not something to design around deliberately. Masonry chimneys provided another partial insight. Large stone chimneys retained heat long after a fire burned down. People noticed that rooms stayed slightly warmer near these structures, but the chimney was not treated as a heat reservoir. It remained an accessory to the fireplace, not the core of the system. Later, enclosed iron stoves marked a significant shift. They improved combustion control and reduced smoke. They allowed higher burn temperatures and better fuel efficiency. But iron stoves lacked mass. They heated quickly and cooled just as quickly. The improvement was real, but incomplete. What was lost in this transition was endurance. Iron stoves solved short-term problems. Faster heat, cleaner burns, easier installation. But they abandoned the long-duration thermal buffering that mass-based systems provided. Heat became something delivered in bursts rather than something stored across time. Several constraints prevented full transfer of mass-based systems. Skilled builders who understood internal flue geometry were rare on the frontier. Construction time competed with survival labor. Transporting large amounts of brick or stone was often impractical. And perhaps most importantly, partial improvements reduced pressure to adopt a fundamentally different approach. Once iron stoves made interiors warmer faster, the deeper inefficiency of constant fuel input faded into the background. The system felt good enough. This is a critical pattern. When an incomplete solution eases discomfort, it often prevents adoption of a better one. The frontier didn't reject heat storage because it failed. It adopted faster substitutes that masked the original failure without resolving it. As a result, the heating system evolved, but its core weakness remained. Heat was still something that disappeared quickly when fuel input stopped. Understanding why that trade-off became permanent requires examining the decisions that followed, who paid the costs, who gained the benefits, and why efficiency lost to convenience. Once the physics are clear, the remaining question is no longer technical. It is economic and structural. If mass-based heating worked better, why did it fade from the dominant path of domestic construction? The first reason is how costs were counted. Mass-based heating systems demanded high upfront investment. They required more material, more labor, and more time. A well-built masonry heater could weigh over a ton and take weeks to construct correctly. That cost was paid immediately, before a single benefit was felt. Open fireplaces and later metal stoves, by contrast, were cheap to install. They delivered warmth quickly, even if that warmth was fleeting. Fuel costs, however, were paid slowly. A household burned wood day after day, year after year. But because fuel gathering and fire tending were folded into daily life, those costs rarely appeared as a single number. Builders were paid once, fuel was paid forever. The incentive favored fast construction over long-term efficiency. Industrial scaling intensified this imbalance. As metal stoves became manufacturable at scale, heating shifted from a built system to a purchased object. Standardized stoves could be shipped, installed, replaced, and sold repeatedly. They fit emerging markets. Mass-based systems did not. They were site-specific, labor-intensive, and resistant to uniform production. Cultural lock-in followed quickly. Once houses were designed around replaceable heaters, the idea of integrating heat storage into the structure itself became unusual. Builders trained for speed, not endurance. Homeowners learned to expect constant fuel input. What had once been a design choice became an assumption. This is just how heating works. By the time fuel scarcity or health consequences became obvious, the system was entrenched. Skills had been lost. Trades had narrowed. Construction timelines left no room for experimentation. Even when people recognized inefficiency, the cost of changing systems felt higher than the cost of enduring them. This is how superior systems disappear, not because they fail, but because they don't align with short-term incentives. When a heating system depends on continuous input, it reshapes daily life in subtle but lasting ways. Energy use becomes normalized as a constant drain rather than a stored resource. Winter heating is treated as something that must run without interruption. The moment fuel delivery stops, warmth vanishes quickly. There is no buffer, no margin, no time to respond. Labor costs accumulate quietly. Wood gathering, fire tending, ash removal, nighttime maintenance, these tasks consume hours every week during cold seasons. Sleep is interrupted. Work is scheduled around heat rather than daylight. Over generations, this labor is accepted as inevitable rather than recognized as the price of a weak system. Health consequences follow naturally. Living spaces exposed to smoke, soot, and fine particulates experience chronic air contamination. Even when later systems reduce visible smoke, rapid temperature swings and dry, overheated air remain common. These effects are rarely traced back to heating design. They are blamed on winter itself. Fragility is the final cost. Systems that do not store heat fail suddenly. A missed fuel delivery, a broken stove, or a short power interruption can turn a home from habitable to dangerous in hours. There is no thermal inertia to buy time. Survival depends on uninterrupted supply. This fragility contrasts sharply with systems built around endurance. A heat storage approach fails slowly. Temperatures decline gradually. Occupants have time to react, adjust, or repair. The difference is not comfort, it is resilience. Over centuries, the normalization of inefficient heating quietly shaped expectations. People learned to accept constant energy consumption, constant maintenance, and constant vulnerability as the price of warmth. The system did not collapse, so it was never challenged at its root. And that is the reckoning. A design optimized for speed and convenience did not merely waste fuel. It taught generations to live without buffers, without margins, and without asking whether a better structure was possible. By this point, the failure of frontier heating no longer looks accidental. It fits a broader pattern that appears whenever survival systems are reshaped around speed instead of endurance. The pattern is consistent. Systems that once stored value are replaced by systems that require constant replenishment. Durable structures give way to faster ones. Processes that reduced daily labor are replaced by processes that demand continual attention. Performance is measured by immediacy, not longevity. Heating is simply one of the clearest examples because the consequences are felt every winter. But the same logic appears elsewhere. Structures designed to last generations are replaced by structures designed to meet minimum standards quickly. Tools that could be repaired indefinitely are replaced by tools optimized for mass production and replacement. Food systems that relied on time, fermentation, curing, aging, are replaced by systems optimized for speed and shelf turnover. In each case, the older system wasn't primitive. It was optimized for scarcity, labor limits, and long-term uncertainty. It assumed failure would happen and built buffers into the system. It treated time as an ally. The newer system assumes continuous input, continuous fuel, continuous supply chains, continuous availability. As long as those inputs flow, the system appears superior. It heats faster, builds faster, produces faster. But when those inputs are disrupted, the system reveals its fragility. This is why the frontier fireplace remained dominant even as its weaknesses were obvious. It aligned with a mindset that prioritized immediate function over stored resilience. That mindset didn't disappear with the frontier. It scaled. Once a system becomes standard, it stops being evaluated against alternatives. It becomes invisible. People don't ask whether it's good. They ask how to manage it, upgrade it, or pay for it. The original design assumptions vanish from memory. Recognizing this pattern doesn't require idealizing the past. It requires noticing what problems older systems were actually solving. They weren't trying to maximize short-term output. They were trying to survive interruptions. They were designed to buy time. Heating systems that stored warmth were not about luxury. They were about margin. They reduced daily labor. They softened failure. They allowed people to sleep through the night without intervention. When that logic is abandoned, systems don't fail immediately. They fail quietly, through dependence. And that is the pattern that connects frontier heating to much more than winter comfort. The difference between inefficient frontier heating and more enduring systems was never climate, intelligence, or resources. It was how heat was treated. One approach chased warmth. Fires had to be fed constantly. Fuel was gathered daily. Comfort existed only as long as effort continued. The system survived by consuming labor. The other approach stored warmth. Heat was produced briefly, captured in mass, and released slowly over time. Fuel worked longer. Labor dropped. Failure arrived gradually instead of suddenly. Frontier homes normalized inefficient heating not because better ideas were unknown, but because faster systems fit the pressures of settlement, limited labor, and later industrial scaling. Over time, those pressures hardened into assumptions. Heating became something you ran, not something you built into the structure. This isn't about returning to the past. It's about recognizing a pattern. Systems that endure store value, reduce daily effort, and fail slowly. So the real question is this: what other systems did we redesign for speed and quietly make weaker in the process?